The radio crackled to life at 3:47 hours, cutting through the pre-dawn silence of Bagram Air Base like a knife through flesh. Any station, this is Viper 6-1. We are taking heavy fire. Request immediate close air support. Grid follows. The transmission cut to static, then nothing. In the darkened operations center, Major Kestrel Ghost, Thorne sat bolt upright in her chair, coffee forgotten, eyes fixed on the tactical display that showed red blinking dots deep in the Hindu Kush Mountains where no red dots should be. The duty officer, a fresh-faced lieutenant whose name tag read Morrison, fumbled for the radio handset. Viper 6-1, this is Bagram Control. Say again your last transmission. Silence stretched like a held breath. Ghost watched the lieutenant's face pale as seconds ticked by without response. She knew that silence, had heard it before in places where good soldiers went to die. Control, this is Mongoose 2-7. Another voice cut through the static, strained and urgent. I have eyes on Viper's position. They're pinned down in a kill box. Multiple muzzle flashes from elevated positions. They won't last 10 minutes. Ghost was already moving, her flight suit half-zipped, helmet tucked under her arm. The lieutenant looked up at her with desperate eyes. Ma'am, all our fast movers are either down for maintenance or committed to other sectors. The closest Apache is 40 minutes out and... What about the warthogs? Ghost's voice cut through his panic like ice water. Morrison's expression shifted to something between relief and skepticism. Ma'am, we have 2 A-10s on standby, but they're scheduled for a milk run resupply escort at 600. Besides, the terrain up there. He gestured at the topographical display showing jagged peaks and narrow valleys. It's not exactly Thunderbolt country. Ghost was already at the door. Get me a weather brief and spin up Hog 11. I'll take the lead bird. She paused, her gray eyes meeting his. And Morrison, tell maintenance I want maximum ordnance load. If those boys are in the shit, we're going to bring them home. The lieutenant nodded, but she caught the doubt flickering across his features, the same look she'd seen countless times before. Another desk jockey wondering if the quiet woman with the strange call sign could actually deliver when it mattered. In 30 minutes, when she was pulling GS in a valley where angels feared to tread, he'd have his answer. Outside, the Afghan dawn was still hours away, but Ghost could already feel the weight of the sky pressing down on her shoulders like an old, familiar burden. Some missions chose you. This was one of them. In the distance, the first A-10 Thunderbolt II was already being pushed out of its hardened hangar, its distinctive twin engines and straight wings silhouetted against the hangar lights like some prehistoric predator awakening from slumber. The real war was about to begin. 20 minutes later, Ghost sat in the cockpit of Hog 11, her hands moving through the pre-flight checklist with the practiced precision of someone who had done this dance too many times to count. The A-10's cockpit wrapped around her like a familiar embrace, titanium armor plating, redundant systems, and enough firepower to level a city block. Outside, her wingman, Captain Jake Diesel Rodriguez, was running through his own checks in Hog 12. Ghost Diesel, Rodriguez's voice came through her headset, tinged with the nervous energy that always preceded a hot mission. You sure about this? Intel saying the weather's going to shit up there. Ceilings dropping fast, and we're looking at possible icing conditions above 8,000 feet. Ghost's response was calm, almost detached. Diesel, those SEALs didn't call for close air support because they wanted to admire the scenery. They're in contact and we're the only game in town. She paused, adjusting her oxygen mask. Besides, when did you start worrying about a little weather? Since they started putting officers who give a damn about bringing their wingmen home in charge of these suicide runs, Rodriguez shot back, but there was affection in his voice. They'd flown together for 8 months, and he'd learned to trust Ghost's judgment even when it defied conventional wisdom. The tower's voice crackled through both their headsets. Hog Flight, Bagram Tower, you're cleared for takeoff, runway 27. Winds are light and variable. Contact departure control on button 2 when airborne. Ghost advanced the throttles on both General Electric TF-34 turbofan engines, feeling the familiar rumble of nearly 10,000 pounds of thrust pushing her 23-ton aircraft down the runway. The A-10 wasn't built for speed or grace. It was built to survive and to kill, in that order. As the airspeed indicator climbed past rotation speed, she pulled back on the stick, lifting the Warthog's nose toward the star-filled sky. Bagram departure, Hog 11 flight of 2, passing 1,000 feet, climbing to flight level 200. Hog 11 Bagram departure, radar contact, proceed direct to checkpoint Bravo. Contact AWACS sentry on 347.2 when crossing the fence. Ghost switched to the tactical frequency and immediately heard the chaos. Multiple voices overlapped in desperate transmission, forward air controllers calling for immediate support, helicopter pilots reporting small arms fire, and underneath it all, the steady, professional voice of Chief Petty Officer Marcus Shepard Williams trying to coordinate an extraction for his trapped SEAL team. Any station, this is Shepard. We've got wounded. Request immediate casevac and gun runs on the ridgeline to our north. We're marked by infrared strobe, 2 clicks south of checkpoint Echo. Ghost's blood ran cold. She knew that voice, had heard it before in another time, another war. Afghanistan had a way of bringing ghosts back to haunt you. The A-10 climbed steadily into the thin mountain air, its engines working harder in the decreased oxygen density. Below them, the lights of Bagram faded into the darkness, replaced by the jagged silhouettes of mountains that had witnessed centuries of warfare. Somewhere ahead in those peaks, good men were dying while she flew through clean, cold air at 20,000 feet. Ghost Diesel, I'm picking up multiple heat signatures on FLIR. Looks like we've got company up ahead. Count 6. No, 8 separate heat sources moving along the ridgeline. They're setting up for something big. Ghost adjusted her multifunction displays, switching to infrared targeting mode. The landscape below came alive with white-hot signatures against the cool purple of the mountain terrain. She could see them now, Taliban fighters moving in coordinated groups, some carrying what appeared to be heavy weapons. They weren't just attacking the SEAL team. They were setting up a kill zone for the inevitable rescue attempt. Diesel, you seeing what I'm seeing? Roger that, Ghost. Looks like they're planning a warm reception for whoever comes to help our boys. Ghost's voice hardened. Then we'd better make sure they don't get the chance to throw their party. She reached for the master arm switch, feeling the familiar click as the A-10's weapon systems came online. The 13 GAU-8 Avenger cannon, mounted in the aircraft's nose like the stinger of some mechanical wasp, was ready to deliver its lethal cargo of depleted uranium rounds at a rate of 3,900 rounds per minute. In the distance, she could see muzzle flashes strobing against the mountainside like deadly fireflies. The battle had already begun, and she was still 5 minutes out. For men pinned down under enemy fire, 5 minutes was a lifetime. The radio crackled again, and this time the desperation was unmistakable. Any station, this is Shepard. We've got 2 urgent casualties and are running low on ammunition. If someone's coming, now would be a really good time. Ghost pushed the throttles forward, coaxing every available knot of speed from the twin turbofans. The A-10 wasn't fast by fighter standards, but it was relentless, like death itself grinding forward with mechanical precision. And right now, she was exactly what those SEALs needed, not a sleek interceptor or a high-altitude bomber, but a flying tank that could take punishment and keep delivering devastation to anyone stupid enough to threaten American soldiers. As they crossed into the target area, Ghost could see the tactical picture unfolding below her. The SEAL team was trapped in a shallow depression near the bottom of a valley, surrounded on 3 sides by elevated terrain. Taliban fighters had positioned themselves in a classic L-shaped ambush, with overlapping fields of fire that turned the valley floor into a killing ground. It was a textbook setup, and it was working. Shepard, this is Ghost. We're 2 A-10s inbound your position. Can you mark your location? Ghost Shepherd, marking now with IR strobe. We're the good guys in the shallow depression, approximately 50 meters south of the large boulder. Bad guys are on the ridgeline to our north and east, dug in behind rocks and in fighting positions. Ghost could see the infrared strobe flashing like a lighthouse beacon through her night vision system. The SEAL team's position was even worse than she'd initially thought. They were completely exposed, with nowhere to run and limited cover from the incoming fire. Worse, she could see fresh movement on the western ridgeline. More Taliban fighters were moving into position, turning what was already a desperate situation into a potential massacre. Diesel, you take the eastern ridge. I'll work the northern positions. Time on target in 90 seconds. Roger, Ghost. Just remember, those boys down there are danger close. We don't have much margin for error. Ghost didn't respond. She was already lining up her first attack run, her thumb hovering over the cannon trigger. The A-10's targeting system painted red diamond symbols over enemy positions, prioritizing threats based on their proximity to the friendly forces below. At the top of the list were 3 heavy machine gun positions that had the SEAL team pinned down. She rolled into a 30-degree dive, feeling the G-forces press her back into her ejection seat. The A-10's engines spooled up to full military power as she descended through 15,000 feet, the mountain peaks rushing up to meet her with startling speed. Through her heads-up display, she could see individual muzzle flashes as Taliban fighters poured automatic weapons fire down into the valley. Shepherd, Ghost, guns inbound from the north, keep your heads down. Roger, Ghost, we're as low as we can get, cleared hot. Ghost squeezed the trigger, and the A-10's GAU-8 cannon came alive with a distinctive BRRRRRRT sound that every ground soldier in Afghanistan knew meant salvation was on the way. Depleted uranium rounds streamed toward the target at nearly 3,000 feet per second, each one capable of punching through armored vehicles. Against unprotected infantry, the effect was devastating. The first machine gun position simply ceased to exist, replaced by a cloud of dust and debris that glowed white-hot on her infrared sensors. Ghost pulled up hard, climbing away from the target area as tracers reached up toward her aircraft like deadly fingers of light. The A-10's titanium bathtub protected her from small arms fire, but she wasn't taking any chances. As she climbed, she could hear Diesel beginning his own attack run on the eastern ridgeline. Ghost, Shepherd, outstanding. That stopped the party for a few seconds, but we've still got movement on the western ridge, and I think they're bringing up an RPG. Ghost rolled inverted and looked down at the battlefield through her canopy. She could see Diesel's tracers stitching across the eastern positions, creating a line of explosions that walked from rock to rock with mechanical precision. But on the western ridge, just as Shepherd had warned, she could make out figures moving a long, cylindrical object into position. An RPG-7 rocket-propelled grenade launcher, capable of killing everyone in the SEAL team's position with a single well-placed shot. Diesel, Ghost, I need you to shift fire to the western ridge. We've got an RPG team setting up for a shot. Roger, Ghost, coming around now. But even as Rodriguez began his turn toward the new threat, Ghost could see they might be too late. The RPG team had found a perfect firing position behind a large boulder that provided both concealment and a clear line of sight to the trapped SEALs. In less than 30 seconds, they'd have their shot lined up. Ghost didn't hesitate. She rolled into a knife-edge dive, pushing the A-10's nose down at an angle that would have made her flight instructors cringe. The airspeed indicator climbed rapidly as she traded altitude for speed, diving toward the valley floor like a 23-ton meteor. At this angle and speed, she'd have one shot at the RPG team before she'd be forced to pull up to avoid flying into the mountainside. The targeting reticle centered on the boulder where the RPG team was hidden. Ghost held her breath, waiting for that perfect moment when training, instinct, and technology aligned to create what pilots called the solution. When it came, she squeezed the trigger and held it down, sending a concentrated stream of 30 rounds directly into the target area. The boulder exploded in a shower of rock fragments and dust. When the cloud cleared, there was no sign of the RPG team, just a smoking crater where they'd been setting up their weapon. Ghost pulled up hard, feeling the G-forces slam her down into her seat as the A-10 clawed for altitude. She'd cleared the mountainside by less than 200 feet. "Holy shit, Ghost!" Rodriguez's voice was filled with equal parts admiration and concern. "That was either the gutsiest thing I've ever seen or the craziest." "Both," Ghost replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "Shepard, Ghost, how do we look?" "Ghost, Shepard, that was beautiful work. The bad guys are pulling back to the north. We're still taking some sporadic fire, but nothing we can't handle. Think you broke their spirit when you took out that RPG team." Ghost allowed herself a small smile as she climbed back to a safe altitude. The immediate crisis had passed, but she knew this was just the beginning. Taliban fighters didn't give up easily, especially when they had American soldiers cornered. They'd regroup, call for reinforcements, and try again. The question was whether she and Diesel had enough fuel and ammunition to keep them at bay until a rescue helicopter could reach the SEAL's position. "Bagram Control, Ghost. Request immediate dust-off for Shepard's location. We have multiple casualties requiring urgent medical evacuation." "Ghost, Bagram Control. All available medevac assets are committed to other operations. Earliest available window is 45 minutes. 45 minutes. Ghost did the math in her head: fuel consumption rates, ammunition expenditure, probable enemy reaction time. They could make it work, but it would be close. Very close. "Diesel, Ghost. We're going to be here for a while. Suggest we establish a combat air patrol overhead and make ourselves known to any bad guys thinking about joining this party." "Roger that, Ghost. I'll take high station, you take low. Let's show these guys what happens when they mess with American soldiers." For the next 30 minutes, Ghost and Diesel worked the valley like a pair of apex predators, taking turns diving down to deliver precise cannon fire on any Taliban fighters brave enough to show themselves. The A-10's distinctive engine sound became a constant presence overhead, a mechanical guardian angel that promised swift retribution to anyone who threatened the Americans trapped below. But Ghost knew their luck couldn't hold forever. Her fuel gauge showed less than 2,000 pounds remaining, and her ammunition counter displayed only 400 rounds of 30 left. Worse, she could see new heat signatures moving in from the north. A large group of Taliban fighters, possibly as many as 30, advancing toward the valley in what looked like a coordinated assault. The real fight was just beginning, and she was running out of everything except determination. Ghost keyed her radio, her voice cutting through the static with calm authority. "Shepard, Ghost, I need you to give me an honest assessment. How many casualties, what's your ammunition status, and how long can you hold position?" The response came back immediately, professional despite the strain evident in Shepard's voice. "Ghost, we have 2 urgent surgical, 1 priority and 1 walking wounded. Ammunition is getting critical, maybe 10 minutes of sustained fire left between all of us. As for holding position..." There was a pause filled with the distant chatter of automatic weapons. "We'll hold as long as we have bullets, ma'am. That's what we do. That's what we do." The simple statement carried the weight of every warrior's creed, the unbreakable bond between those who fight and those who support them. Ghost felt something tighten in her chest, not fear, but responsibility. These men trusted her to bring them home, just as she had trusted others in darker places and harder times. "Roger, Shepard, help is coming. Just keep doing what you do." She switched to the command frequency. "Bagram Control, Ghost. I need a status update on that dust-off. Also requesting any additional close air support assets available. We have a large enemy force moving toward Shepard's position." "Ghost, Bagram Control. Dust-off is en route, ETA 15 minutes. However, the medevac bird is reporting small arms fire along their route. They may need an escort. Ghost looked at her fuel gauge again. 15 minutes to get the SEALs extracted, plus however long it took to escort the medevac helicopter back to safety. Her internal calculations were grim. She might have enough fuel to complete one of those missions, but probably not both. Diesel Ghost, what's your fuel state? Ghost Diesel, I'm showing 1,800 pounds, maybe 20 minutes at current consumption rate. The math was unforgiving. Between them, they had enough fuel for maybe 40 minutes of flight time, and that was cutting it dangerously close. If the medevac helicopter encountered problems, if the extraction took longer than expected, if the Taliban launched another major assault, any number of variables could leave them flying on fumes with American lives hanging in the balance. Ghost made her decision with the cold clarity that had kept her alive through 3 combat tours. Diesel, when the dust-off arrives, I want you to escort it back to base. I'll maintain station here until everyone's safely away. Negative Ghost, we go home together or not at all. That's been the deal since day one. Jake, listen to me. Ghost's use of his real name instead of his call sign carried weight, a signal that this wasn't a request but an order. Those SEALs need someone overhead until the last second. If we both escort the medevac and leave these guys alone, the Taliban will be all over them before the helicopter clears the valley. Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, and Ghost could almost hear him running through the same calculations she'd just completed. When he finally responded, his voice was tight but resigned. Understood, Ghost, but you'd better find a gas station up there, because I'm not explaining to the squadron commander why I came back without my flight lead. Despite everything, the danger, the dwindling fuel, the approaching enemy forces, Ghost found herself smiling. Don't worry, Diesel, I've got a few tricks left. What she didn't tell him was that those tricks might not be enough to get her home. The A-10 was tough, nearly indestructible by most standards, but it couldn't run on determination alone. Physics was physics, and fuel was fuel. When the tanks ran dry, even the legendary Warthog would fall out of the sky like any other machine. But that was a problem for later. Right now, 30 Taliban fighters were moving toward 4 wounded Americans, and she was the only thing standing in their way. Ghost rolled into another attack run, her cannon spooling up with that familiar mechanical growl that meant death was coming to anyone stupid enough to threaten her people. As she dove toward the enemy formation, Ghost's mind drifted briefly to the photograph tucked into her helmet bag back at base. A picture of her younger brother in his army dress blues, taken just before his deployment to Fallujah in 2005. He'd never made it home from that deployment, killed by an IED while on a routine patrol 3 weeks before his tour was scheduled to end. She joined the Air Force 6 months after his funeral, driven by a need to understand what had taken him from her. Now, 8 years later, she finally understood. It wasn't the enemy that had killed her brother, or the war, or the politicians who'd sent him there. It was the silence, the deadly quiet that fell over a battlefield when there was no one left to answer the call for help. Tonight, there would be no silence. Not while she still had ammunition, not while her engines were still turning, not while there were Americans on the ground who needed her. She squeezed the trigger, and the night erupted in fire and thunder, driving back the darkness with the fury of her 30 cannon. The Taliban fighters scattered under her assault, diving for cover behind rocks and in shallow depressions that provided little protection from her depleted uranium rounds. Ghost walked her fire across their formation with methodical precision, each burst carefully aimed to maximize damage while conserving ammunition. She couldn't afford to waste a single round, not with her ammunition counter showing only 200 rounds remaining. Ghost Shepard, beautiful work. The bad guys are pulling back to the north again. That bought us some breathing room. But even as Shepard reported the enemy withdrawal, Ghost could see the tactical situation developing. The Taliban weren't retreating, they were repositioning, moving to higher ground where they could set up a more effective crossfire. In 10 minutes, maybe 15, they'd be back in force, and this time they'd have learned from their mistakes. Shepherd Ghost, I need you to be ready to move fast when that dust-off arrives. The bad guys aren't giving up, they're just getting smarter. Roger Ghost will be ready. In the distance, Ghost could see the navigation lights of the medevac helicopter approaching the valley, flying low and fast to avoid detection. The U-60 Black Hawk was painted in the neutral tan and brown colors of the medical corps, marked with prominent red crosses that were supposed to provide protection under the Geneva Convention. In reality, those symbols often made medical helicopters bigger targets for insurgents who viewed wounded Americans as valuable propaganda victories. Dustoff 7-2 Ghost, I have you in sight approaching from the south. Be advised, we have sporadic enemy activity on the northern ridgelines. Recommend you stay low and move fast. Roger Ghost, Dustoff 7-2 has the zone in sight, beginning our approach now. Ghost watched the helicopter descend toward the valley floor, its rotor wash kicking up a cloud of dust and debris that would provide some concealment, but also announce its arrival to every enemy fighter within miles. The pilot was good. She could tell by the way he controlled his descent, trading speed for altitude in a controlled spiral that minimized his exposure time to ground fire. But as the Black Hawk flared for landing, Ghost saw what she'd been dreading. Muzzle flashes began winking from the northern ridgeline like deadly stars, and green tracers started reaching down toward the helicopter and the SEAL team's position. The Taliban had waited for exactly this moment, when American forces would be most vulnerable during the extraction. Taking fire, taking fire. The medevac pilot's voice was tight with concentration as he fought to keep his helicopter stable under enemy fire. I need immediate suppression on that ridgeline. Ghost was already rolling into her attack run before the transmission ended, diving toward the muzzle flashes with her cannon charging. She had less than 150 rounds left. Every shot had to count. As she lined up on the enemy positions, she could see individual Taliban fighters through her night vision system, men in traditional robes and turbans, hunched over their weapons as they poured fire down into the valley. Ghost inbound hot, 30 seconds. She squeezed the trigger in controlled bursts, walking her fire across the ridgeline with surgical precision. Each burst lasted only a second or two, but in that time, her cannon fired 60 rounds of depleted uranium that struck with the force of small artillery shells. The Taliban positions erupted in clouds of dust and debris as her ammunition found its targets. The enemy fire slackened immediately, giving the medevac crew the breathing room they needed to complete their mission. Ghost pulled up from her attack run, her ammunition counter now showing only 70 rounds remaining. Enough for one more engagement, maybe two, if she was very careful with her trigger discipline. Dustoff 7-2 Ghost, ridgeline is suppressed. You're clear to complete your pickup. Roger Ghost, loading casualties now. We'll be out of here in 60 seconds. But 60 seconds was a lifetime in combat, and Ghost could already see new movement on the eastern ridgeline. The Taliban were adapting quickly, moving to new positions even as their comrades nursed wounds from her cannon fire. They'd learned that attacking the northern ridge was futile as long as she maintained overwatch, so they were shifting to an angle that would force her to choose between protecting the helicopter and suppressing enemy fire. Ghost keyed her radio to Rodriguez. Diesel Ghost, that dust-off is going to need an escort the moment it lifts off. I'll maintain station here and keep the bad guys honest. Ghost Diesel, roger that. But what about your fuel state? You've got to be running on fumes by now. She glanced at her fuel gauge. 800 pounds remaining, enough for maybe 10 more minutes of flight time if she was conservative, less if she had to use afterburner or fight at high power settings. It would be close, very close, but she'd faced longer odds before. Don't worry about me, Diesel. Just get those boys home. The medevac helicopter lifted off in a cloud of dust, its crew chief visible in the open door as he provided security with an M240 machine gun. Ghost watched it climb away from the valley floor, gaining altitude and speed with every second. But as it did, the Taliban fighters on the eastern ridge opened fire, their tracers arcing through the darkness toward the climbing aircraft. Ghost didn't hesitate. She rolled into a diving left turn, bringing her nose to bear on the new threat even as her fuel quantity warning light began flashing red on her instrument panel. The eastern ridgeline lit up under her cannon fire, 70 rounds of .30 ammunition finding their targets with deadly accuracy. The enemy tracers stopped immediately as the surviving fighters dove for cover. "Dust off 7-2, you're clear to the south. Diesel, they're all yours." "Roger, Ghost, I have the package, see you back at base." Ghost watched Rodriguez's navigation lights disappear into the distance, escorting the medevac helicopter and its precious cargo of wounded SEALs back to safety. The valley below was suddenly quiet, the muzzle flashes that had lit up the ridgelines for the past hour now dark and silent. The immediate crisis had passed, but she wasn't out of danger yet. Her fuel gauge now showed less than 400 pounds remaining, and she was still 15 minutes from base. The math was simple and unforgiving. She didn't have enough fuel to make it home. Not at current consumption rates, not without taking risks that could kill her just as surely as enemy fire. Ghost keyed her radio one last time. "Shepard, Ghost, package is away clean. You boys did good tonight." "Ghost, Shepard, thank you, ma'am. Don't know what we would have done without you up there." What they would have done was die, Ghost thought but didn't say. Instead, she began a slow climb toward the south, nursing her remaining fuel and hopping against hope that she could coax a few more miles out of her faithful A-10. The aircraft had never let her down before, carrying her through 3 combat tours and more close calls than she cared to remember. But as her fuel quantity continued to drop, Ghost began to face the possibility that tonight might be different. Tonight, the machine that had been her partner, her weapon, and her salvation might not have enough left to bring her home. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd saved the lives of 4 Navy SEALs, men who would go home to their families because of her actions tonight. But in doing so, she might have made the ultimate sacrifice that every combat pilot understood was possible, but hoped they'd never have to make. As she flew through the darkness toward an uncertain future, Ghost thought about the letter she'd written to her parents before deploying, the letter every service member writes but hopes will never be delivered. In it, she tried to explain why she'd chosen to serve, why she'd put herself in harm's way for people she'd never met and might never meet. Now, with her fuel running low and the lights of Bagram still invisible in the distance, she finally had the answer. She served for moments like tonight, when American soldiers needed someone to stand between them and death, and she was the only one in position to do it. That was worth any risk, any sacrifice. The A-10's fuel quantity warning changed from flashing red to solid red, indicating that she had less than 200 pounds remaining. At current consumption rates, that gave her maybe 4 more minutes of flight time. Bagram was still 8 minutes away. Ghost began her emergency checklist, preparing for the possibility of a forced landing in hostile territory. She reduced power to minimum, trading altitude for distance as she stretched every drop of fuel. The A-10 began a shallow glide toward home, its engines barely idling as she tried to cover the remaining distance on momentum alone. At 5,000 feet above ground level, with the lights of Bagram finally visible in the distance, both engines flamed out simultaneously. The cockpit fell silent except for the whistle of wind over the aircraft's surfaces and the electronic warnings telling her what she already knew. She was out of fuel and out of options. Ghost keyed her radio one final time. Bagram Tower, Hog 11, declaring emergency. Dual engine failure due to fuel exhaustion. Dead stick approach from the north. Hog 11 Bagram Tower. Roger your emergency. All traffic is cleared. Runway 27 is yours. Emergency equipment is rolling. Ghost looked ahead at the runway lights stretching out like a pathway of stars. 2 miles away, maybe a little more. She had the altitude to make it, but just barely. The A-10 was a tough aircraft, built to survive battle damage and keep flying. But even the legendary Warthog couldn't defy the laws of physics indefinitely. She lowered the landing gear and configured the aircraft for an emergency approach, feeling it sink faster in the thin air as the additional drag took effect. The airspeed indicator showed 180 knots and decreasing, still well above stall speed, but dropping steadily as she traded energy for distance. 1 mile from the runway, with red and blue emergency lights visible along the taxiways, Ghost realized she was going to make it. The A-10 might be a flying tank, but it was also one hell of a glider when it needed to be. She crossed the runway threshold at 140 knots, touching down with a thump that sent vibrations through the entire airframe. As the aircraft rolled to a stop on the darkened runway, surrounded by emergency vehicles with their lights flashing, Ghost sat in her cockpit for a long moment, listening to the mechanical sounds of cooling engines and settling metal. She'd done it, brought her aircraft and herself home after a mission that should have been impossible. More importantly, she'd brought home 4 American soldiers who might otherwise have died in a remote valley in the mountains of Afghanistan. That was what mattered, what made everything else worthwhile. As the ground crew chocked her wheels and connected external power, Ghost began shutting down her systems for what might be the last time in this particular aircraft. Tomorrow, there would be debriefings, maintenance inspections, and probably a lot of questions about her decision to continue the mission with critically low fuel. But tonight, 4 Navy SEALs were alive because she'd made that choice. 4 families wouldn't receive folded flags and empty condolences. 4 men would have the chance to grow old, to see their children graduate and get married, to live the lives that military service sometimes demands its practitioners forfeit. Ghost climbed down from her cockpit, her legs shaky from adrenaline and exhaustion. The night air was cold against her face as she pulled off her helmet, and she could see her breath in the thin atmosphere of the Afghan mountains. Around her, maintenance crews were already beginning their inspection of the aircraft, looking for battle damage and mechanical problems. But as she walked toward the squadron building, Ghost couldn't help but look back at the A-10 one more time. The aircraft sat on the ramp like some prehistoric predator, its nose art barely visible in the darkness. Tomorrow, it would fly again, carrying another pilot into harm's way in defense of American soldiers. Tonight, though, it had brought her home, just as she'd brought home 4 Navy SEALs who would otherwise have died in the mountains. It was a fair trade, she thought, a very fair trade indeed. In the squadron-ready room, Ghost found Diesel waiting for her with a cup of coffee and a grin that stretched from ear to ear. Hell of a thing, Ghost. Hell of a thing. Those SEALs are going to be fine, by the way. The docs say all 4 will make full recoveries. Ghost accepted the coffee gratefully, feeling its warmth spread through her body. Good, that's what matters. Flight surgeon wants to see you in the morning. Apparently, landing an A-10 with 0 fuel is the kind of thing that gets people's attention around here. Ghost shrugged. I had fumes left, maybe a gallon or 2. Rodriguez laughed, but there was something else in his expression, respect, maybe, or admiration. You know what they're saying about you in Intel. They're calling tonight the miracle of the Hindu Kush. 4 SEALs extracted from an impossible situation by a pilot who shouldn't have been able to get home herself. Ghost didn't respond immediately. She'd heard the whispers before, the stories that grew in the telling until they bore little resemblance.